Welcome back, friends. Dan Vega here, and today we're going to continue on in our series of building serverless functions using AWS Lambda. Today we're taking a little bit of a step forward and closer to building real-world applications. Today we're going to connect to a database, one that we've created in AWS RDS, specifically a Postgres database. So we'll talk about how to make that connection in a normal Java project, how to work with things like environment variables, and how we can test it. So again, we're just continuing on in this series, trying to build some serverless functions and look at different use cases for that. So I think today is going to be real fun. It's more of a practical example, and I hope you get something out of it. What are we waiting for? Let's write some code. In order for us to connect to a database, we actually need to create a database. So I'm here in Amazon RDS, and I've already created a database. I don't want to make this about setting up an RDS database here, but you can come into RDS, go to your dashboard, create a new database. Here I've chosen to create a new PostgreSQL database. So if you go in here, you get information about it. You can get endpoints. So here's my host, here's my port. You can set up a username and password. This is really all of the information that you'll need to go ahead and create the database. Once you have the database created, I created this table. So I have a database called newsletter in here. I've created a table called subscribers, which really just has an ID and an email. If you do a select all on this database, I have 5 records in here, and they're just email addresses. So what I want to do with that is I want to create a new project in IntelliJ, pretty much similar to what we've been doing in the past tutorials. We're going to create a new project, and we're going to write a function that connects to this database and lists out all the subscribers. So with that, let's jump into IntelliJ. All right, here I am in IntelliJ. I'm going to go ahead and click Create New Project. I'm in my AWS Playground folder, and I'm going to create a new project called Hello RDS. Again, we're going to use Corretto 11 from Amazon as our JDK. For our archetype, we're going to just choose Quick Start, and then we're going to add a couple properties here. We're going to say dev.danvega as the group ID, and actually I'm okay with Hello RDS as the artifact. So we're going to go ahead and create this. And once that's created, I'm going to add a few things here. So first off, we're going to add our Maven compiler target and source and set our Java version to 11. Whoops, sorry for closing that. And then we need to kind of fix some dependencies here. So the first dependency we're going to add, we talked about this in the past, is the AWS core. So you can see AWS Lambda Java core. So we're going to go ahead and add that. Now, if you were going to talk to or really work with events in AWS, there is a AWS Lambda Java events. And this would be like if you wanted to listen for an event, say, if a row is added to this particular table, we could then react to that and maybe, send an email to an admin saying a new subscriber signed up. But I'm not going to do that here. I just want to make you aware of that. We'll get into some events in some future videos. The next thing we need is a dependency for the database that we're talking to. So we're talking to a Postgres database. We need a Postgres driver. And that's going to come from org.postgresql and the current version, which is, I'm going to use 23. I don't think 3.7 would be wrong, but I know that that's the version I was using, so I'm going to stick to that for now. So I have those two, and then another dependency I'll need is JUnit Jupyter. So we can grab that from JUnit Jupyter and the current version. So those are my dependencies. I'm going to go ahead and reload this. And then as we've done in previous videos, I need the Maven Shade plugin. I have a little live template to bring that in for me. This is the Maven Shade plugin, which will go ahead and create an Uber jar with everything in it that we need that we can then go ahead and upload to Amazon. Okay, so that's the first part. We basically set up the dependencies in our project and we're ready to go. So I'm going to go over to source main. Again, I'm going to delete this and I'm going to delete this. And I'm going ahead and create a new Java class in here, and we'll call this list subscribers. All right. So now we've done this in a previous video. The one thing we could do here, because we have that AWS Lambda Java core, is we can come in here and say implements request handler. We can take an input and an output. So I could take like an input of string, And ultimately, what I'm going to return is a list of all the email addresses in that table. So that would be a list of strings, which would be the output. So I can go ahead and implement that method and this would work. The problem is I don't really need to pass anything as an input to this request handler. I don't need to send it something. In this particular example, I don't need the context. I don't need to get a logger. So I'm actually not going to use it just because I want to keep this a little bit simpler as we start to progress. That test would get a little bit more confusing. So I want to keep this simple. I'm just going to create a simple request handler that doesn't implement that request handler. So this is going to be a public. It's going to return, again, that list of strings. We are just returning a list of email addresses. And we're going to call this handle request. So again, I don't need to take anything as input. So I'm not going to have any arguments there. So the first thing that I want to do is go ahead and say I have a list of strings. We'll call these subscribers. And this is going to be a new array list. And this is ultimately what we are going to return. So what I can do is actually can just go ahead and make this part of our class. And we can say that this is private. And that's what we're going to go ahead and return. So far, so good. So now we need to connect to a database. And this is where things get fun. So this is, again, we're using pure Java here. What I'm doing with a lot of this is ultimately going to introduce you to something on the Spring side called Spring Cloud Function, which will allow us to do a lot of the things that we need to do, like connect to a database, interact with the database, persist, read, get configuration, logging, all the things that Spring does well. But to get there, I want to go through this step of kind of introducing you to coming back to plain old Java and how we have to do things. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a connection to that database that we created in RDS on AWS and connect to it and then read from it and display all of the email addresses. So how do we do that? So if you go back to kind of Java 101, first thing that we need to do is we need to get a connection. So we'll call this con. And we'll say we need the driver manager.get connection. And so this is going to take a JDBC URL, a username, and a password. So let's come back to that in just a second. This is also going to catch a SQL exception. So let's say SQL exception E, and let's go ahead and just throw a new runtime exception with that error. So how do we get the JDBC URL? So let's say string JDBC URL is equal to what? So this is going to be made up of JDBC / PostgreSQL. And then we need the host, the port, and the DB name. So I'm going to grab this information. Again, this is once you set this up in RDS, you'll have this information, right? So I'm grabbing this from there. So the host looks like this. Then we need the port, which is our case going to be 5432. That's the default port for Postgres. And then the database name, which is newsletter. So that's our JDBC URL. So now we can pass that here, JDBC URL. Now we need a username. So the default username is Postgres. And we need a password. I've set up a demo password. This is a demo password. Okay. We're going to move this to to a different class. We're going to move these connection properties to a class in a minute, because ultimately you don't want to store this stuff in plain text in your Java class, right? If you're pushing this to GitHub or something, then all of your information is going to be exposed. So we're going to store this in a separate class and use environment variables. But let's just get this to work first. I'm a big fan of getting this to work first and then refactoring later. So we have our connection string for our JDBC URL. And then once we connect, if we're connected, we should be able to go ahead and read from there. So first I want to check if that connection is valid. So is valid. We're going to have a timeout of 0. So if that is true, I want to say unable to connect to, and then we can just say JDBC URL. So unable to connect, and then I'm going to exit the application. So there we go, that's good. Now if the connection is valid, we want to do some things, right? So we're going to set up a prepared statement. We'll call this a select statement. And what we're going to do is say connection.prepare statement with some SQL, and that's basically going to be select star from subscribers. All right. Next, we can get a result set, and we can say from our select statement, I want you to go ahead and execute that query. Now what we get back is we can say while we have another value in the result set, I want you to go ahead and iterate over that. We're going to get the email out of this. We're going to say result set.getString, and we can get that from the email is the label, basically the column. And then what I'll do is I'll just print out that email address. And then what I want to do finally is to our list of subscribers up here, I want to go ahead and add that one. So let's say add, and there we go. So far so good. So if the connection is not valid, let's just throw some little error here. Again, this is where we would use some real logging in place, right? I'm just trying to get this to work first. We can always refactor later. Unable to connect, exit. If we are able to connect, let's create a prepared statement. We're going to select star from subscribers. We're going to use a result set here to execute that query. And then while we have a result, let's iterate over that and get the email out of the result set and add that to our subscribers. So ultimately, that is going to return a list of strings, and that is what our handle request methods contract is. So this should work. Let's go ahead and refresh Maven here. And now we need a way to test this, right? There's no main method here. We can't just execute this. So what I want to do is I want to create a test. So let's go in here and say create test. And again, this is going to be more of an integration test since we are actually using a live database. So say void should list all subscribers. So our system under test is going to be the new, what do we call this? List subscribers. So that's our system under test. What I want to find out is, let's assert equals. We should have 5 records that come back. And so what I want to do is that system under test handle request, that the size that is returned from that should be 5. So we can also go ahead and add a static import here for that, and that should work. So all we're doing is we're creating a new instance of this class. We're calling handle request, and what we get back is a list of strings, and we just want to check that that is currently 5 because we're using that production database that I have, right? So let's see if we can go ahead and run this and test this out. And there we go, it does work. And we're actually printing out each one so we can see those values that get printed to the console. So cool, this seems like it would work, but it's not all that great, right? We have these hard-coded values in here, and that's not really gonna work for us. So what I wanna do is I wanna create a new class here, and we're gonna say new Java class, and we'll call this data source properties. And this is going to be a class. And sure, we'll go ahead and add that. I'm going to just add some code so you don't have to watch me write all of this, and let's talk about it. So we have some final properties here. So we have a host, port, DB, username, and password. We have a constructor, a no-arg constructor. So if somebody calls the no-arg constructor, then what happens is we are going to get these values from an environment variable, right? So the host one is getting it from an environment variable called RDS underscore hostname. Again, we have a DB, a username, a password, and a port. So this is if there is a no-arg constructor called. Then we also have an all-arg constructor so that we can supply values for this as well. So in the real world, we would write a test that probably doesn't use the production database, right? So we can provide our own information here. So let's refactor our test to go ahead and provide these values. We're going to provide the same values, but I want to go ahead and provide those in the test. Now to do so, back in my list subscribers, I'm going to do something here. I'm going to say, let's see, we have that already. Let's say private. We'll call this final data source properties, and we'll call this DB. So we're going to have a constructor that takes this in. So list subscribers. We're going to have data source properties. We'll say DB. This.db is equal to DB. So now we can create an instance of this class and pass in our data source properties. Now there's one problem here. We're also going to need a no-arg constructor because the AWS Lambda function has no way to call this. There is no dependency injection here, right? So we need a no-arg constructor that the AWS Lambda function can call. And in that case, we're just going to say new data source properties. And now that no-arg constructor will basically get all of the values from environment variables. So that satisfies both our test and our real world, right? So this looks like it's going to work, although this is not going to work now. We're going to have to fix our test. So to fix our test, I'm going to do this in a before each, just in case we have some other, just in case we have some other tests that we need to write. And I'm going to go ahead and say that we have I'm going to pass in these properties. So I'm going to say DB is equal to this. And the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to say private list subscribers. That's our system under test. And I'm also going to say private data source properties, and we're going to call this DB. So I'm setting DB here. Now what I can do is I can say a system under test is equal to new list subscribers, and I'm passing in an instance of our data source properties. So now under here, I don't need to do that. I just have that. But what I want to do is actually get a list of those. So let me say set.handle request. And so that should return basically a list of strings. We'll call those emails. And then now what I can do is just say this should be emails.size. All right. So let's just talk about what we're doing here again. When this test gets set up, we are creating a new instance of the data source properties. We're passing in some real values here because I want to be able to test this. This is like my integration test, if you will. Again, in the real world, I would probably have something like a Docker instance running with a local Postgres database that I would be testing against that, or using something like test containers. But this will work right just for this example. So I have this. I pass that into list subscribers. So now when we call handle request, it is using these properties, and we go ahead and check that the emails that come back is expected as 5. So let's go ahead and run this. And it's working as expected still. So great. So this is working. Now, one more thing, if you want to go ahead and test that the environment variables work, you could always just say right here, you could always kind of comment this out, right? And you could say db is equal to new data source properties. And then, you can call the noarg and then basically set up your environment variables. So if you're in something like IntelliJ, you can always come up here, go to edit configurations, and in your application itself, so let's see where the application is. Okay, so I didn't run this yet, but I could set up my application here for this, and I could say in my environment variables, I could pass those in here. So just an example if you want to go ahead and run that locally. So I'm going to actually take this back. We're going to keep this as is. And that should be good. So what I want to do is actually build this now. So we remember we have this pom.xml, we have our Maven Shade plugin. So what we should be able to do is go ahead and run Maven clean package. And you'll see that we get that, that jar that we're expecting. So now we can head back over to AWS Console, and we're going to upload this jar, and we'll talk about how to configure those environment variables on the Lambda side. All right, so we're going to create a new function. Let's call this YouTube Hello RDS. Actually, let's call this list subscribers. All right, and we're going to use the Java 11 Corretto runtime ARM64, and then we're going to go ahead and create that function. All right, and then we're going to go ahead and upload. We're going to go ahead and find that jar we just created, which is hello RDS, and then target, and then hello RDS.jar. We're going to go ahead and save that. Again, we're going to come down to the runtime settings. We're going to change this to dev.danvega. Let's just double check that. What was it? Dev.danvega, list subscribers, and then the function is handle request. So we're going to go ahead and save that. Now don't run this yet because we need to do one more thing. So we're going to go over to configuration, and there's an environment variables tab, and this is where we're going to set up all those different environment variables. Now remember, in our data source properties that we had names for these environment variables, things like RDS hostname, RDS DB name. You can name these whatever you want, but these need to match up on the AWS console side. So we're going to go in here. We're going to say add environment variable. We're going to say RDS hostname, and then I got to go ahead and add that particular host. So we're going to say that. Add environment variable. Let's just double check. I like to make sure I'm getting the right ones here. RDS DB name. That's going to be newsletter. Add environment variable. We're going to say RDS username and password. And then I think we have one more, RDS port. And that is 5432. So cool. We have our host name, DB name, newsletter, RDS username, which is Postgres, our password, and then our port. So let's go ahead and save this. Now, if we go back over to our code and go to test, we should be able to test this out. Again, we're not passing any input here, but we do need to set this to an empty string to test it here in the console. Let's go ahead and click test and see if this works. Yay, it succeeded. And as we see this, we have our email addresses below as a list of strings. So this is just a collection of strings that's being returned. Now, again, if you put any of the our environment variables were missing and it didn't succeed, you would see it here. You would see the issues that you're having. So look at the logs. Again, you can see this is a pretty large cold start here at 391 milliseconds. The duration took a while. We can see on that subsequent request, we got it down to 396 and 395, and then down even farther, and it's just going to get faster and faster. All right, and one more thing I want to take a look at. This is great, but how can we go ahead and access this from somewhere outside the console? So I may or may not talk about this in a separate video all by itself, but I just want to let you know that here you used to have to go ahead and set up an API gateway in AWS to go ahead and hit this. Now you can come in here and go to function URL, and you can create a function URL. And you can basically say, hey, who's allowed to hit this? Anybody with identity access management users? Or you could just say none. I just want to make this public. You can configure cores if you need to. If you're basically going to allow someone to create a new subscriber, you would configure cores here. I'm just going to leave this wide open because I'm going to delete it afterwards. But now that we have a function URL, we should be able to go to this and it will call our list subscribers and return the list of email addresses. So as you can see, it's done this over and over again. So every time we hit this, we are not, that is one reason why I did this in here. So let's fix that. I thought I'd be cute and put this at a class level. But we can do this here. So what you'll want to do is set this to, subscribers is equal to a new array list, right? Because if not, that just gets created over and over again. And while we're here, again, we are inputting this information by hand here, and we don't want to do that. So what we want to do is get that from our db.getJDBC URL. This will be our db.getUsername, and this will be db.getPassword. And now that should work much better. Cool. I'm not going to build this and upload this. This will work, but once you have the subscribers in here and not getting set at the class level, that's why I was outputting more than once. So really hope you enjoyed this. This was, again, a progression on our series of videos here. You know, at the beginning, we created just a simple AWS Lambda function that returned hello world. You know, we start taking a look at the AWS Lambda core library and how we can implement that request handler. And now we're kind of building on that functionality and starting to build some real world applications here. In this one, we're talking to a live database. We're getting a list of subscribers. And as you can imagine, if you open up cores on this function URL, now this is something you could use from a front-end application. So if you wrote some front-end application component that wanted to list out all of the subscribers, you could do so because you can access this. So I hope this is starting to open your mind to the possibilities of things you can do with AWS Lambda and serverless functions in general. So if you did find value in this, friends, do me a huge favor. Give me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and as always, happy coding.